Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Hope everyone is doing well. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa afdalu salatu wa tamu taslima ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت الحكيم العليم اللهم انشر علينا رحمتك وأنزل علينا حكمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. Thank you everyone for joining us here again. The first one, of course, the first session, we kind of organized all of our thoughts, and then now we're going to talk about the crises that Imam al-Ghazali encountered and how it relates to us. A lot of today's discussion is about what does it mean to be authentic? What does it mean to be genuine and to be real? The word personality in Latin comes from the root persona. Anybody knows what persona means? It's not like a Latin class, but in case anybody knows. If you guys went to fancy boarding schools, you'll know. Character, identity. See, those are all positive traits, like character. So that's like a good thing, having good character. Identity, that's like sense of self. So that also connects persona. Then you would think it means like being your true self, like who you identify it. But it doesn't mean those things, although those are good guesses. It's quite the opposite, actually. The word persona means mask. So this kind of ties in really well to the Islamic spirituality framework, because the modern framework for spirituality is the idea of finding the self, right? And in finding yourself, so then you're going to be your genuine and authentic and true self. So that journey of self-exploration is kind of the vehicle in order to get there. But in the Islamic way of thinking framework, it's actually our personality, our persona is only the exterior. This is the veneer. This is the part that everybody gets to see. That's the exterior. And in reality, the exterior of the person is hiding who the person is behind the mask. Right? And so spirituality is about getting behind the mask and trying to look inward as to really paying attention to what is outward. So that's really going to, just to frame our discussion today, is going to be about that. As we know, Imam al-Ghazali, in my view, is the single most influential Islamic thinker. And as we mentioned, there have been lots of other thinkers, a lot of other great scholars in his time, after his time, before his time. But in terms of defending orthodoxy and orthodox mainstream theology, he is the most famous, and that's why he's called Hujjatul Islam. He is considered the proof of Islam because he spent his entire life on this quest for the truth. We talked last time about the story about him getting robbed, right? And so a lot of us, when negative things happen, we think like, oh, that must be a sign that this isn't what I should do. But what was his reaction? Where the bandits, they tried to like steal all of his books. And so people would view that as like a sign, like, oh, now what am I going to do? And how did he view it? It's quite the opposite, right? So now the bandit is telling him, and he's a thief, he hasn't studied anything, barely knows how to read. And he's like, well, you can't know much if all I had to do was take your books away. Like, that means that your knowledge is in the books and not in your mind, right? But that actually was the cause for him acquiring great knowledge. And that's why he's known as the Mujaddid of the 11th century. As we mentioned, the essence and the core of the Ihya, and what we're going to be talking about for the next 2 Sundays, is that at the essence of every belief and every practice, there's a spiritual purpose. Whether it's zakah or hajj or salah or seeking knowledge, there is a spiritual refinement. There's an aspect of tazkiyah, of purification of the heart, of transformation that is at the core of every single thing. And that's why we named this session From Ritual to Spiritual. Because a lot of times we go through the routines and we get used to doing things because, oh, those are the steps of prayer. But have we really thought when we go into sajda that this is the moment in which our heart is at the lowest point? Our heart is raised and our mind is at the lowest point. So what does that mean, right? What does it mean that we direct our bodies towards the qibla, to orient ourselves, right? What does it mean that in Arabic we write from right to left, towards the heart? What does it mean that when we make tawaf, we go counterclockwise with the heart facing the Kaaba? Do these things have significance, or are they just accidents? No. The idea is that there's a spiritual meaning behind all of these. Of course, there's the ritual, which is important. وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever magnifies, whoever glorifies, whoever gives import to the sha'air Allah, the symbols of Allah, that is an expression of the taqwa of the heart, right? So that's God consciousness. But if you are reflecting on the deeper meaning and deeper significance, then it's not information, it's transformation. We talked about the two crises. The first one, which we're going to conclude on today, is the crisis of cynicism, of skepticism. He's in a period in which there's a batiniya threat, where people, they said, well, we need certainty. So here we have an infallible imam who's going to speak on behalf of the truth, and he speaks with authority, and you should just follow it. And then on the other side, you have the philosophers, you have ilmul kalam, you have al-mutakallimun, right, the theologians, and they're responding, but they're using the toolkit of Greek philosophy. And then you have the Sufis, and they're talking about spiritual ecstasy, they're talking about experiential knowledge, they're talking about divine witnessing, mushahada. So he's trying to reconcile all of this. Well, where do I find, I mean, the Sufi path seems very subjective. It's like, well, this is just dhawq. This is something that you just taste and you feel, but you can describe it. So it's like, well, I can't, my mind doesn't accept that, right? The batiniya threat that you should just follow somebody blindly, well, his mind doesn't accept that either. When he looked at philosophy, that also had its issues, which we'll talk about. Then the second crisis, which we're going to begin our discussion, we're going to begin that conversation today. We're going to conclude that tomorrow, next week, inshallah. That is the most important topic for this session, for the Sunday program, which is the crisis of the spirit, of motivation. What is it that moves the believer? What is it that excites the passions of the believer? What is it that makes you real and genuine? What is it that brings out sincerity? And this is very salient coming from somebody who was arguably the greatest scholar in his time period, right? And so, and of course, he attained all the accolades that a person could aspire to in that period, and yet he felt a feeling of hollowness. And many of us might relate to his feelings, where we also experience that feeling of hollowness, that we aren't finding meaning in our religiosity. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean to follow the deen, and what does it mean to have tadayyun, right? So tadayyun is like religiosity. And sometimes if religion becomes very mechanical, especially when it becomes defined by others and how others perceive you, then it actually is devoid of meaning. And that's really what his book is about. This is the book Al-Munqidh min al-Dalala. It's 80 pages. It's a very short book. This is an autobiography that he authored. This is actually probably Dr. Tariq's favorite book. And I know that it had a big impact on his thinking and on his own life trajectory. And so, of course, if he joins us, we can also seek his input on that as well. The launching pad of this conversation is Imam al-Ghazali's search for certainty. Can we ascertain truth, right? And this is something which I think Muslims uniquely sought out. Because if you look at a lot of the other faiths, it was based on this concept of blind faith. But then when we examine the Quran, especially if we go in a deep reading, istiqra, if we read the Quran deeply and we ponder on it, then Allah says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Do they not deeply ponder into the meanings of the Quran? أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Do they not engage their intellect? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seemingly wants us to use our rationality based on the sense data inputs. Based on our perception of reality, we're supposed to synthesize certain conclusions, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the people, يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا, they engage in remembrance while standing, وَقُعُودًا, and while they are seated, وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ, and while they're on their sides, وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ, and they reflect, فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, in the creation of the heavens and the earth. مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ. You surely could not have created all of this in vain. Subhanak, transcendent are you. You sublime are you. فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. So keep us safe from the hellfire. So it seems from our revelation, from our faith, that certainty is something that we should aspire to. But here we have a great scholar who's a master in religion. He's a faqih. He's teaching law to more than 300 students at the most prestigious university in his time. And he comes to the conclusion that the deeper knowledge of haqa'iq, of realities, is not going to be found in books alone, right? So it's not just in books, there's something experiential, but then it's not necessarily what the Sufis of his time were describing either. Now, he talked a little bit about the different types of knowledge, which we talked about quickly last time. The sensory knowledge, right? So the eyes, our perception, we see the day and the night. It's subjective, and it's also prone to error, because if you have fever and you ask somebody that has a fever, is it hot? Even if it's actually cold, what is the person going to say? They're going to subjectively say, well, I think it's hot. So they will be completely deluded into thinking that that is the actual reality. So sensory knowledge is subject to our own perception, right? Even though sight seems really, so sight, for example, it seems like the strongest, right? Because it's more detailed. But if you look at a sundial and you ask somebody to look at the sundial and it seems like it's at 1 o'clock, and you ask the person, is the sundial stagnant? Is it moving? What is the person going to say? Locked in that moment, they're going to say it's stagnant. It's not moving. Because no matter how long you stare at it, for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, you won't be able to perceive such a slow movement. Because it's moving gradually in small distances, and the eyes cannot perceive such small differences. But in reality, if you were to leave and come back, you would see that the sundial is in a totally different perception. So sight has its limitations. Then he examines rational knowledge, mathematical knowledge that causes a person to question their a priori assumptions. But just as the sense is not infallible, the intellect can also be deluded, right? You might think something is true, but it's not. So for example, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, in which you start with certain axioms, certain a priori assumptions that you assume to be true. So for example, if you say, I exist, it seems like based on rational thinking, but in reality it's based on sensory data. It's something that you sense. But even that is an axiom, because do you really know whether you really exist? No, that's just an assumption that you have to start with. And then of course Imam al-Ghazali, he prefers math, because mathematically, and this is an aspect of his thinking that's very modern, because he views things as always being true. So you can't argue with him that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, because he knows that they're always going to equal 2. And then what he does is he divides philosophers into 3 different categories. He says you have the materialists. These are the ancient philosophers. They allege that the world existed from eternity of itself and not by reason of a maker, right? So in the Greek philosophy, they believed in pre-eternity. This is called azaliya. They also believed in post-eternity, abadiya, that if something exists, it cannot seek to exist. And if something exists, it has always existed, right? Because the idea of creation, something existing from nothingness, is something that's foreign to Greek philosophy, right? So only the Muslims believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that khalaqana min adam, He created us from nothingness, right? And everybody knows, when إِذَا أَرَادَ, if Allah wants to create something, He only says, you guys with me? What does Allah say? Kun fayakun. He says, be, and it is, kun fayakun. So as the poet said, he said, my existence is bayn al-kafi wal-noon. My existence is between the letter kaf and the letter noon. Bayn al-kafi wal-noon. Because Allah merely said kun, be, and it is. That's the first category. So there's something problematic there. Then the second category, the naturalists. These are the people who study the world of nature. They've seen the marvels of Allah's making, and they're compelled to draw the conclusion that there must be intelligent design. There must be a wise creator that has a divine purpose. But the problem is then they concluded that the soul dies, never to return. So the naturalists, they denied the afterlife. They denied judgment and resurrection. So now he has a problem with the naturalists also. Then he talks about the theists. These are the later philosophers like Socrates and Plato, who of course is the teacher of Aristotle. And Aristotle, according to Imam al-Ghazali, he said he organized the previous statements that were very imprecise. But he still considers them to be prone to disbelief and innovation. And he lists the people who fall under this category. And most prominent of them, of course, are Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. Now, last week when I was talking about this, I got mixed up and I mentioned about Ibn Rushd. But of course, Ibn Rushd had not written yet. Averroes comes after the time of Imam al-Ghazali, so that comes later. So what he does, he divides philosophy into 6 categories. He says you have math, you have logic, you have natural sciences, you have metaphysics, you have politics, and you have ethics. He says mathematics, logic, and natural sciences don't contradict religion. But then he says the problem with this is that people who go into that, then they go on to study metaphysics. That should be avoided. And he says this is the science which is the most dangerous. He divides into philosophy. He says it tackles 20 questions. 3 of them lead a person to disbelief, to kufr, and 17 into innovation. And in his commentary, he categorizes the beliefs of Ibn Sina and Imam al-Farabi as within the category of disbelief. So what are the 3 problems that he comes to the conclusion in terms of philosophy? Number 1, the denial of a corporal last day. They don't believe in judgment. Number 2, they believe that Allah knows universals, but that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not know particulars. And part of the problem is that they are viewing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as operating within time. Right? We're not gonna go too deep because we might get lost there. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Prophet ﷺ said, do not curse time. This is a hadith Qudsi, in which the Prophet ﷺ is relating from Allah that do not curse time. Why should we not curse time? Because the Prophet ﷺ related from Allah, فَأَنَا الدَّهْرُ, because I am time. Not in the sense that Allah exists within time, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created time. So that's a dimension that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created and that we're all operating within. So if you view Allah as operating within time, so then what's going to end up happening is you're going to come to the conclusion erroneously that Allah knows something and then comes to know something later. And that's not possible. And then the third thing is the eternity of the world. Now, as a side point, they also denied the divine attributes, that Allah is known by His essence, right? So what we believe is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى, as Qari Anas recited a few nights ago in the Taraweeh prayers. So Allah has divine attributes. So for example, we know from the 99 names that Allah is As-Sami', He is the all-hearing. We know that Allah is Al-Alim, the all-knowing. We know that He is Al-Hakim, the all-wise. But can we separate His attributes, His omniscience, His all-knowingness? Is that super added onto His that, into His essence? Is it something that's added to it? Or are there attributes that are inherent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now, the problem is, they believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes are separate from His essence. And this contradicts the belief of the Aqidah and the belief of Muslims. So this is also a 4th problem. Okay. So this is the problem that he has with the philosophers. He writes the book about Tahafat al-Falasifa, about the incoherence of the philosophers. And then during this crisis of knowledge, he comes to the conclusion that all knowledge and any knowledge is fallible, right? So for example, if somebody told you, and he comes up with this example, that 3 is more than 10, and then that person turns stones into gold or a stick into snake, then would you believe them? And he said, no, it wouldn't change my conclusion. The fact that the person who's advocating for that position is able to do something that's extraordinary. The only thing that it would do is that it would make me wonder that how is it possible that a person is able to change a stick into a snake? So for example, in a dream, if you're in a dream, you might believe that what you're seeing in your dream, you might be completely certain that this is actually real. But then when you wake up from the dream, what do you come to realize? Then you come to realize that everything that you saw in the dream, that you had perceived as reality, that you took as an unquestionable fact, was in fact an illusion. And so then in that case, what proof can theology, can kalam, or philosophy give us to guarantee that our senses are not deceiving us? So here's what he says. He says, despite all of the knowledge that I had acquired, I still could not resolve this simple and fundamental problem. A battle was raging between my heart and my head. He says, I became physically ill. He says it was a bewildering time. So here he has this crisis of cynicism. And now many of us, of course, many of us are like, well, that never bothered me. I just believed what I had inherited from my parents. And this is, if someone's iman is satisfied, if your faith, if you're content in what you have received and what you have learned, then that's a good thing. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put that quietude in your heart and you're content with what you know, then that's a good thing. But because we don't want anyone to force doubt upon themselves. One of the attributes of the disbelievers, Allah says in the Quran, that فِي رَيْبِهِمْ يَتَرَدَّدُونَ, that they are doubtful as to their own doubt. Why? Because questioning is part of their ethos. And so the reason for seeking certitude is not to open up new doubt, but rather to close up and to remove doubt. And the doubt was because he started to question some pseudo-certitude, some things that had been passed on from generation to generation, some things that he was just told was part of the belief, and that now he realized that he had just passively accepted as truth. Whether it was coming from the theologians, or whether it was coming from the traditional knowledge he had acquired, or whether it was coming from the philosophers or the Sufis, he realized that these were just assumptions. And so he's in this period of sickness that lasts nearly 2 months. And he says, I became practically a skeptic, even though outwardly he wasn't. Outwardly, he's teaching classes and he's the scholar that everybody aspires to learn from. But in reality, inwardly, he's in a state of turmoil. And he said that he came to realize that he needed a spiritual reformation. He had to reconstitute his being. He had to be willing to sacrifice everything that he had gained, everything that he had for the sake of, what's he seeking? For the sake of certitude. That's what he's seeking. And then after these 2 months, then he comes to a period of enlightenment in which he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala healed me. He restored me to health. Now this is interesting because the crisis that he had was an intellectual crisis. He had a problem with the sensory data. He had a problem with his rationality. He had a problem with his mind. So one would easily draw the conclusion that his enlightenment would come from where? From his own mind. It would be, he had a crisis of his rationality, of his intellect, so you would think that the enlightenment would come from his mind, but now he talks about how Allah had healed me. He's talking about a restoration of the heart. So how does this come to play? He said that it happened through a light that Allah the Most High had cast. And that light is the key to the greater part of knowledge. Now this reminds me of the words of Imam Shafi'i. Because we know, and perhaps you've heard me say it before, Imam Shafi'i had a photogenic memory, but he wasn't born with it. He actually complained to his teacher that he wasn't able to memorize faster. And so he writes in his poetry, شَكَوْتُ إِلَى وَقِيعَ سُوءَ حِفْظِي I complained to my teacher, Imam Waqi', that I had poor memory. فَأَرْشَدَنِي إِلَى تَرْكِ الْمَعَاصِي. And so his teacher, he employs him to leave off sin altogether. إِلَى تَرْكِ الْمَعَاصِي. Not to sin at all, to not have any blemishes. وَقَالَ إِنَّ الْعِلْمَ لَنُورٌ. And he said that knowledge is light. That's the key thing. Knowledge is light. Knowledge is not information. Knowledge is light. وَلَا يُعْطَى عِلْمُ اللَّهِ لِعَاصِي. And the light, the knowledge of Allah is not given to a disobedient person. So what he realizes is that he has to be willing to put everything on the line. He has to be willing to give up something, to give up everything in order to receive that illumination. And that's a reframing of his mind, that what I'm seeking is something that takes hold in the heart. It's a knowledge, something which is cast directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not necessarily distilled through the mind. That only happens if you have an open heart to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we would say, al-iqbal ala Allah. That being open to receiving that knowledge, that information, that light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now this is very different. It might sound like this is, well, didn't he reject what the Sufis had said about mushahada, about divine witnessing, about experiencing some kind of spiritual ecstasy? Now he's talking about something different, even though it sounds similar. What Imam al-Ghazali is talking about is receiving enlightenment, which is something which takes place between the heart and the mind. And as some of the scholars have mentioned, this openness, iqbal ala Allah, it happens when the heart is in which kind of state? Because the heart is a vessel, right? And so there are periods of constriction. There are periods of qabd. Many of us have experienced that. And it might even happen in a worldly sense. There might be people that you encounter, there might be family relationships and other types of relationships in which you're not open to receiving that. Because emotionally, how are you? You're closed off. And some people are not only closed off to others, they are closed off to themselves. And when you're closed off to yourself, you're also closed off to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is what we called qabd. When a person is closed off. And the opposite, if you want to receive that, especially tonight, for example, many of us will be here and listening to the beautiful recitation of Quran by Qari Anas. And one person might be standing in the prayer and their heart is in a state of bast, of openness. They're receiving the Quran and that person might not even know the meanings of the words, but they hear a few words here about the hellfire, about paradise. They hear some verses about the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as Allah describes them, that tafidu min ad-dam', that even their eyes will be overflowing with tears. Why? Because they're experiencing a connection, receiving the light of guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, people like all the imams, it's not only me, all of the imams we have experienced, we go a lot and we go to churches and synagogues and we meet public officials and gatherings of non-Muslims. And we have personally, all of us have witnessed people who are not Muslim who have heard the verses of the Quran recited for the first time. And we have seen people not shed a tear, we have witnessed people who have broken down in tears. I have personally met people who said, I don't know what you said, I don't know what it means. You could have been reading from the newspaper, I wouldn't have known. But you spoke to my heart. I've heard people say that I've never heard the Quran before. One lady, I remember, this is actually when I was a teenager. This is like, I won't tell you how many years ago that was. It was a long time ago. And she said that I know that the Quran has to be from God. Because there's no way a human being can put that together. And that was it. And she didn't become Muslim. And who knows, may Allah guide her. You never know where her path is going to lead. But I saw from her face that she was absolutely convinced that the Quran is the word from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But how many Muslims don't have, they might be listening to the same verses and they might even understand the words, but they don't have that experience. Why? Because their heart is in a state of qalb. It's closed off. And many people are going through their day and they're not experiencing the present because either they're overly obsessed with the past or they're overly concerned about the future, right? And they are not sahibul waqt. They are not living in the moment. They are not receiving all of the manifestations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sending you throughout your daily life. And they're missing all of these signals, right? So for example, you might be saying, well, I don't know if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is accepting my fast. I don't know if Allah is going to accept my worship in the month of Ramadan. But then as Ibn Ata'illah said, and many other scholars, they said, إِذَا أَرَدْتَ أَن تَعْلَمْ مَقَامَكَ فَانْظُرْ حَيْثُ أَقَامَكَ. You guys must have Alhamdulillah. Batteries died, but our hearts are still alive. So that's what counts. Alhamdulillah. So going back to what we were saying, it's about being in a state of accepting the moment, and not constantly questioning that, am I good enough? Did I do enough? Am I worthy? Just look at where Allah placed you. Look at where everybody else in the society is. How many people are battling addiction? How many people have conflict and in their homes? How many people are suffering, even among Muslims? I mean, this is a reality for Muslims. We live in a time in which almost the majority of people are suffering from depression. And if you are one of those people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in that moment to really, like to be here, for example, that means something. So we get so used to interpreting grand episodes as having great meaning, but then we miss our daily situations that might even be more meaningful. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so for example, you get a phone call and an appointment gets canceled. And so we're like, now I'm gonna have to reschedule. But in the back of our mind, do we think of, that gives me an extra time to be with the kids? Like, maybe that, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, right? Oh, well, since I have this extra time, why don't I read an extra juz'ah? And then maybe that juz is what allows you to complete your khatam and to complete the recitation of the Quran in the month of Ramadan. So you might not know what the reason is, but just the way of thinking, the way that you're receiving events as they're happening, not like comparing reality to the outcome that you have predetermined is the one that you prefer and the one that you consider to be the right outcome, as opposed to receiving things and understanding that I'm exactly in the place that Allah chose me to be in, and I'm exactly there at the time that Allah chose me to be there. That nothing is late and nothing is going to happen early. Okay, so how is that relevant in today's confusing time? We live in a time that's similar to the time of Imam al-Ghazali, in which authority is being questioned. Right? There was a time in which, in his time, in which religious fanatics were questioning the secular authority. In fact, at that time, they were assassinating them. There was confusion everywhere. And the modern time is also confusing and difficult. There's no clear light. And there's so many groups. When you look at Muslims, everybody seems to have another slogan, and people are asking, well, which sheikh do you follow and which person do you listen to? And then when you tell people, well, I just follow regular Islam, I'm just a regular Muslim, I'm Ahlul Sunnah, I'm following the people of the Sunni path, the Sunni way. People want you to narrow that down because to them that's too murky, that's too confusing, because people have created gray areas where they don't actually exist. They have created divisions. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that when people divide themselves, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, each group بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. They rejoice, they celebrate that we are this sect and and how many of us have encountered that, right? And Allah said that لَسْتَ مِنْهُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ, that you have nothing to do with all of these divisions. Allah says in another verse, لَا تَنَازَعُوا, do not differ with each other. Why? Because if you differ with each other, فَتَفْشَلُوا, then you will fail. وَتَذْهَبَ رِيحُكُمْ. And this is the part I want to focus, that when you become divided, when you become caught up in the weeds, you know, people are so worried about like, where am I putting my foot in the salah? And where are we putting our hands? And how many inches is the beard? And what's the exact position of this and that? Why? Because these are the dhawahir, these are the things that we're able to perceive. And I'm not denigrating their importance. Some of those things may have some importance, but they are not the most important things. Why do we obsess about them? That's easy. We obsess about them because we can see them. But in reality, the things that we can't see are more important. As the Messenger ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ صُوَرِكُمْ وَلَا أَجْسَامِكُمْ. That Allah does not look at your forms. He doesn't look at your bodies, right? So many of us were like, well, am I beautiful? And what does that mean? If we're asking that question, if I ask you, do you think that you're beautiful? And you automatically gravitate and you think about that question in physical terms, then that means we're doing something wrong. Is everybody with me? When you ask that question, are you beautiful? And you start thinking about whatever body, in which we all have body image issues, right? Everybody does. They're like, oh, I like this, I don't like that. Insecurities, I'm not the right fit, I'm not this, I'm not that. But if immediately you think that beauty is something which is physical, then right off the bat, that means we're living for others. Because Allah doesn't perceive any of that. وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ. But rather, Allah only looks to your hearts and to your actions and to your deeds. And your deeds, of course, are reflective of who you are as a person, what you're made of. And so Imam al-Ghazali, he makes this point that don't be so obsessive with which school of thought you're going to follow, right? Because in his time it became, people were hyper fixated with which imam and which scholar and which group. When the reality is that if you take somebody who's Hanbali, for example, in the legal school of thoughts, and you take somebody who's Hanafi, they are going to be 99% the same. We're differing only in less than 1% of matters, and the 1% that we differ in are matters that are not of great consequence, that are not of great import. And even different theological positions are okay. In the matters of aqeedah, we have some people who are Ash'ari, some people who are Maturidi, some people who are Athari. It's all fine as long as they are within the limits, right? If somebody's interested, Al-Aqidah Al-Tahawiyah, this is the benchmark. All of the Muslims, they can't agree on 99, a lot of other things, but everybody said, Imam Al-Tahawi, he got it right. That's the Islamic belief system right there. So as long as somebody is within those boundaries, then we embrace them. Then we say, these are our brothers within faith. And so orthodoxy doesn't mean that you become a zealot, that you become extreme, that religion becomes like a weapon, right? Religion can get weaponized. It becomes a tool where you feel better than other people. And if you use religiosity, if you use religion as religiosity, then what ends up happening is then you start to feel a sense of superiority. Then you start to feel that my religion is what makes me feel that I'm above others. And when that starts to happen, then you have to be really fearful. Then you're like the person who used to pray in the front row of the salah for 40 years. One day he got delayed, and he was so embarrassed, he was ashamed even to enter into the masjid. Anybody know what he ended up doing? 40 years he was praying in the front row, right behind the imam. One day he got delayed, and he was so embarrassed. He's like, I can't even show my face. He was so embarrassed, he didn't even pray with the jama'ah. What did the man go back and do? He had such a crisis. This was an existential crisis for him. He went back and repeated 40 years of prayers, because he realized that all 40 years he had been praying for so other people would consider him a religious man. And everybody has a different poison. That may not be you. Maybe it's hard for you to come to the masjid. That might be your struggle. Everybody's going to have a different struggle, right? But the people who are always there, who are like, oh, it's time for salah, and they dress the right way, they talk the right way, and they sound like, oh, you're a namazi, you're a very religious person. They're still, you think shaitan is leaving that person? No. Shaitan doesn't leave anybody off the hook. So everybody's dealing with different, this is the talbis of Iblis. This is the trickery of shaitan. He's going to attack everybody according to their level. In the case of Imam al-Ghazali, it was fame. He was invited to meet Nizam al-Mulk. He's the chief wazir for Malik Shah, who is the Khalifa in Baghdad. And he joins the Nizamiya as the provost, as the dean. And he's preaching at these large gatherings. He's teaching these major texts, these deep, advanced texts. And what does he say? He said, it went to my head. This is a person with deep knowledge, the greatest scholar of his time. And he said, I started to think that things were right just because I said it. Right? This happens to a lot of influencers. They start posting on Instagram. Nowadays they're posting on TikTok too, right? They're all over the place. And they start to believe because, oh, 50,000 people liked it. It doesn't matter. There are a lot of videos out there with a lot of likes and they're wrong. I mean, I see recordings. A lot of people send me sometimes recitation of the Quran. And you see that it's been liked like 1 million times. And I'm like, that recitation is wrong. You should come to ICCP. We recite much better than that, right? But why? Because it sounded good, so people hit like. Now that's fine, but that doesn't make something true just because people like it. And so you have the best students that are traveling for thousands of miles. He's producing books that are affecting the trajectory of history. He's accusing leaders of having this hypocrisy of forced consciousness. He's doing it publicly, and he's trying to protect the orthodoxy. But then, at the end of the day, you know, when you point the finger, the other fingers are pointing back at yourself. So Imam al-Ghazali, he has this crisis. He said there was something that was gnawing at me. There was a suspicion that I'm not practicing what I'm preaching. There's something wrong with myself, because religion has become stale. It has become didactic. It just becomes a slogan, something that I say. It becomes a dry practice. It is not something, وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. As Allah mentioned in Surah Al-Hujurat, that the iman has not fully permeated and penetrated every single part of my heart. Why? Because I'm busy with argumentation. I'm debating with students. But is he debating like Imam Ash-Shafi'i said? He said, whenever I used to debate someone, I would make a supplication that the words of truth would come from the lips of my opponent, from the tongue of my opponent, not from my own tongue. Look at the humility of Imam Ash-Shafi'i. Many of us, usually guys, real talk, when we're in a debate or a discussion with somebody and they're talking, we're only listening for one reason, right? Because we're trying to figure out what? Next thing we're going to say. That's usually half the time when we're in a conversation, we're like kind of listening, but we're synthesizing our next statement. We are not soaking in deep sharing. How many of us in our family lives, husband and wife, parents and children, how many people are 100% present, where they're really there? Like, I really want to know what you think about this. And we're worried. We're like, I don't get that from my parents. Well, do they get that from you? Your parents are 30 years older than you. If they can give you 50% of that presence that you give them, then you're doing well. Then that should be sufficient for you. But what ends up happening is we debate for its own sake. So then what he comes to the conclusion is the spiritual pathology of the ego. And this is something which is also, since we mentioned about Christianity early, this is something that the Buddhist religion talks a lot about, is about the ego being the source of corruption. Because he said the person can't be entrenched in their own agenda, because then there's no recognition of the opponent. Because in that universe, only you exist. Nobody else exists in your bubble. But in order for you to arrive at the truth, you and your opponent have to collectively be in the search and the pursuit of truth. And then if that happens, then it's not about ego stimulation. It's not about overpowering. It's not about debating and overcoming that person. That's not the object, but rather the truth. Now, at the beginning of this session, I talked about the word personality. You guys remember? The word personality comes from what word? Persona. And persona in Latin means mask. It's not sense of self. It is that veneer, that external, what we show to other people. And Imam al-Ghazali, he realized that the famous Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, that's just the appearance. That's the mask. That's not the real person behind the genius, the brilliant writer, the wonder boy, the favorite of the Khalifa, of the Wazir. It was a person who was falling apart. A person who was in deep turmoil, who was in struggle with himself. He didn't like who he was. The reality of Imam al-Ghazali was that he hated himself because he realized that he was a fake, that he was a charlatan. And how many of us can relate to that? Because we're just going through the motions, but we're not actually being our true self. And what that means in the Islamic context is different from what you hear outside of these walls. From the Islamic concept, your true self is the realization of your ubudiyyah, of your servitude, your iftiqar ilallah, your being impoverished before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your inkisar, you're coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a state of imperfection, in a state of brokenness. Not having to fake an appearance that everything is perfect because you're trying to fit in and impress others, but because that is your true reality as Abdullah, as the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he comes to the conclusion that all the intellectual knowledge is camouflage, ignorance. Why? Because he knows about fiqh, he knows about Quran, he knows about hadith, he knows about mustalahat, he knows about all of these topics, but he is ignorant about the most important thing. And what is that? What was Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, what did he realize that he was ignorant about? There's two possible answers that are really the same. The knowledge of Allah, that's the second one, that's the higher one. Because the pursuit, our very existence, is about ma'rifatullah, is about knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the way that you come to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is by knowing yourself. And so even though, because he had put up this beautiful veneer, because he had acquired all of that outward knowledge, he had actually become even more deficient in the inward knowledge. And the inward knowledge, knowing the self, is in reality, because what is the nafs? The more you investigate yourself, what do you come to the conclusion? That the nafs is? The nafs, so the nafs is not Allah, of course, but the nafs is from Allah. Let's go a little bit deeper. Let's figure this out together. What is the nafs? The nafs is? It's a shell. The nafs is hollow. The nafs is nothing. The nafs is empty. Why did Allah create us with a sense of hollowness? So a person might go through depression. Many of the people we have a large gathering. People are listening online. Many of us might be saying, I relate to that. That if things are going well, I feel happy. But even when things aren't going bad, I feel hollow. I feel a sense of deep sadness. I feel depression without a reason. And we might say, well, that seems unnatural. Something is wrong with me. But in the Islamic spirituality, we will say nothing is wrong with you. If you experience depression, why would we say nothing is wrong with you? Because the natural state of the human being is to seek meaning. Allah subhanahu wa فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made us in a state of hollowness. So if you don't give it meaning, then the human being will feel disconnected. The only way in which the heart is satiated is when it is connected. And that's why you've heard me make the dua that Ya wasil al-munqati'een. Oh Allah, you are the one that joins the disconnected. Awsilna ilayk, connect us to you. And so Imam al-Ghazali, for 6 months, he goes through this depression in which he is between his worldly desires and longing for the eternal life. He takes one step forward. One day he takes a step backward. And he's feeling like my time is limited. He said, there's no guarantee of tomorrow because I'm a mortal person. How do I prepare for this journey? Now this is something that all Muslims can relate to. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, أَكْثِرُوا مِن ذِكْرِ هَازِمُ اللَّذَّاتِ. He said that increase your reflection and remembrance of the destroyer of all pleasures. What is the destroyer of all pleasure? This is an authentic hadith. What is the destroyer of all pleasures? We know this. Death. The Prophet ﷺ, he encouraged us to remember death. And it seems morbid for someone who's not Muslim. But brothers and sisters, when we reflect on death, then what do we appreciate? We appreciate life. If you come to terms with your mortality, then you come to utilize your life. As the Prophet ﷺ said, اغتنم بخمس قبل خمس. Take advantage of 5 matters before 5 other come to pass. One of the 5 categories, the last of the 5 that he said, وَحَيَاتِكَ قَبْلَ مَوْتِكَ. And your life before your death. So thinking about death is not to obsess about death. Because we believe death is the life of barzakh. It is another existence continuing, but it is a place in which there are no a'mal. We can't do any more deeds. So this crisis of the human condition is to realize your own mortality. Then Imam al-Ghazali, he says, God caused my tongue to dry up. So I was incapable of lecturing. My prominence was taken up. I was unable to speak. And he says there was a psychosomatic reality. He said my body started to be overcome by that disease. In today's word, we will call it depression. He suffered a loss of appetite, sleeping, seriously ill. He examined his own motives and he concluded, and many of us will come to this conclusion, that I was not truly motivated by Allah. I was not sincere. I was seeking influential position. I wanted public acclaim. I wanted to be famous. I wanted to be influential. I wanted to lead others. And so he crumbled back and he said, I'm at the brink of entering into the hellfire. And we might wonder, how could a great scholar like that think that he's going to enter into the hellfire? But his condition is even more dire because he's in a position of influence and power, and perhaps he's doing it only for self-aggrandizement. And so then he examined in the end the Sufi way, which remember he was very critical of. He said this is about spiritual ecstasy, this is about mushahada, right? He said this is about divine witnessing. And he said this is not about action, this is not about engaging the intellect. But then he finds a different perspective that combines intellectual belief and practical action. And he comes to the conclusion that it is action in the form of removing and purging obstacles to the soul, stripping away the characteristics, those character traits and morals that come between you and that create a veil between you and knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is different from what the Sufis of the time, they were looking for certain mukashafat, for spiritual ecstasy or experiences. And what he's talking about is a different kind of spirituality, which is to come to know your Creator, about ma'rifatullah. And he says, then the heart achieves its freedom. Why? Because it is free from everything, as Dr. Tariq mentioned in the Friday khutbah. He said that spirituality is about divorcing yourself from as-siwa. Were you guys here on Friday? Most of you weren't here on Jummah, actually. I don't recognize. Anybody who was here on Friday, I guess you were here on Friday. What did Dr. Tariq? I'm the only person listening to Dr. Tariq's lecture. In the Jummah khutbah, he talks about as-siwa. Siwa means other than. He said that spirituality is about purging everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tazkiyatun nafs, purification of the heart, is about removing everything other than Allah. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fills the heart. So that's why we say, La ilaha illallah. Because first we have to remove al-jibt, we have to move at-taghut, any false deity, any false worship, any even stain of shirk. And then what comes and fills the heart is the tawheed and the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, that is when the experiential knowledge goes to there. And then he travels and he begins his journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Next time that we meet, inshallah, we're going to talk about the knowledge of the self. This is the 4 categories. Number 2, knowledge of Allah, knowledge of God. 3, knowledge of the world. And number 4, knowledge of the future world. These are the categories described in Kimya as-Sa'ada. Inshallah, we'll conclude. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that afdalu dhikrin, the best of all dhikr, is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. We said La ilaha illallah. So please join us, inshallah. If you prefer to say it silently, that's fine. Say it in your mind. As you know, most of the scholars, they all said that dhikr in a group setting is permissible. There were a few who said no. So if you prefer to do it silently, that's also fine. La ilaha illallah, 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 hasbi rabbi jallallah, ma fi qalbi ghayrullah, nur Muhammad sallallah, la ilaha illallah, hasbi rabbi jallallah, ما في قلبي غير الله نور محمد صلى الله لا إله إلا 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 الله 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 لا إله 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 إلا الله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about those who seek forgiveness in the time of the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. So this is the time also for istighfar. So please join me. The Prophet ﷺ, he used to ask Allah for forgiveness 100 times in a day. even though hypothetically if he were to sin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven his past and future sins. Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. تبت إلى الله ونهيت قلبي عما سوى الله. أستغفر الله. تبت إلى الله ونهيت قلبي عما سوى الله. أستغفر الله. تبت إلى الله ونهيت قلبي عما سوى الله. أستغفر 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 الله. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all of our fasting, all of our good deeds. May Allah illuminate our heart with the nur of Iman and the nur of ma'rifatik, of coming to know you, Ya Akram al-Akrameen. We conclude with salawat on the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam and upon his family. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I think there's 1 minute left. Reminder, the Prophet ﷺ said that ثلاثة لا ترد دعوتهم. There are 3 categories in which their dua is not refused. All of their dua are mustajab. One of the 3 categories, as-sa'imu hina yaftur, when the fasting person is at the moment of breaking their fast. So a reminder to all of you to ask Allah to accept your forgiveness, to enter you from the highest levels of Al-Jannah, that Allah make us min al-maqbooleen, al-faizeen, that Allah makes us min utaqa'i shahri Ramadan, from those who are exclusive in the month of Ramadan, who are saved from the hellfire. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you and your family and all of your loved ones. Have mercy on those from your loved ones who have passed away, and may Allah heal from those of your loved ones who are sick. شفاء لا يغادر سقما. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. بارك الله فيكم. I think it's time, right?
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا